Welcome all hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters to the only fish and wildlife conservation podcast that goes behind the scenes of the business of conservation, the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Our podcast is hosted by John Gassett from the Wildlife Management Institute and Jim Cucaruto of the Outdoor Stewards of Conservation Foundation. John and Jim will talk with experts from all sectors of the conservation arena about their passion for conserving the great outdoors. So please welcome our hosts of the Connecting with Conservation podcast, John and Jim.
Welcome to another episode of Connecting with Conservation, the only podcast that goes behind the scenes to look at the business of conservation in the United States. I'm John Gassett with Wildlife Management Institute and your co-host for Connecting with Conservation. Here with my fellow co-host, Jim Cucaruto from Outdoor Stewards of Conservation. How you doing today, Jim?
If you asked me that an hour ago, I wouldn't have had an answer. I got too many things going on, but I'm glad to kind of slow down and sit down and learn something new with our guests. I always, enjoy the time doing these Connecting with Conservation podcasts, but doing much better now that we've got a great guest on, Tony also from Wildlife Management Institute. So we got a double and up here, but, I've known Tony for a while, but I want to hear a little bit about Tony's, background, personal hunting, fishing, all that sort of stuff before we get into the more business side of things. So welcome, Tony, and give us a little background on you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, John. Really appreciate the opportunity to join you guys today. Appreciate what you do, getting this message out. It's critical information. So I guess I'll kind of just start with my career. I spent a couple years trying to break into wildlife at a time that was really tough to get wildlife jobs back in the 90s. I spent a couple years in the ag industry in Idaho, working with potatoes and working with grain, and found that I had to go to Nevada for my first opportunity in the wildlife world, and started as a habitat biologist. Did that for a few years, and then went out in the field as a game biologist, and spent 10 years as a field biologist managing mule deer and elk, pronghorn, Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, and goats, as well as a few other things. And after 10 years of doing that, I moved into the state headquarters and took a position that was half-time running the state deer program and half doing research on mule deer. Did that for 4 years, and then took a big risk and jumped into the director role, and spent my last 10 years with the agency as director of the agency, and retired from that in January of 2023, and was retired for all of 3 months before I came to the NGO world at WMI. Been an awesome change. Really enjoy the opportunity to join the ranks at WMI, John and others, incredible organization. And I've been doing that just over 2 years now.
Very cool. And I know you're dedicated, like just about everybody in the conservation space, to your job and to conservation, but I know you like to have some fun outdoors too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really the common thing that kind of got us all into this work, was just the passion for being outdoors and fishing and hunting and camping and being outdoors. And I was fairly young and trying to figure out where I wanted to go for my career. And I thought, where do I feel most at home? Where do I feel most comfortable? When am I most content? And it was those times that I was outdoors, just in the middle of nowhere, and pursuing things, adventures, journeys, fishing, hunting. And I thought, man, if I could do that all day, every day, sign me up. And that was the one thing that gave me the direction and ambition to actually complete my college education. So I still get out every year, and have had some unique opportunities here in my home state of Nevada with bighorn sheep, and angle as much as I can. The driest state in the country doesn't provide as much opportunity as a lot of states do out there, but I find creeks and ponds here and there, and wet a line every chance I get. So I still get out as often as I can.
So Tony, like the rest of us, you enjoyed hunting and fishing growing up and everything, and then so you go into the wildlife field and you figure out too late that you get to do less of that when you're in our profession than you would think. We spend more time managing the people than we do, getting to participate in resource consumption.
Yeah, and then you realize that we're pretty unique in terms of our passion and the relevance that conservation holds to us. That it's an ever present challenge of trying to make a whole lot of the public care as much as we do.
Sure. Well, and Jim and I have been doing this for about a year now, and we don't focus on, our organizations. This is about the relationship between manufacturers and the excise tax and our customers and the agencies that do all the work. But, you are the CEO and president of Wildlife Management Institute, which is who I work for and have for a number of years. And, it's one of those organizations that we joke about it being the best kept secret in conservation. We do a lot of things for, with a small staff, but not as many people know about us as they do some of the more iconic big organizations. Talk a little bit about what WMI does, what its priorities are and its mission is.
Wow, that's an interesting question coming from somebody who's probably can answer it better than I can, but I'll take a stab at it. So I think at a high level, 30,000 foot overview, our purpose is to conserve wildlife and wild places to enrich the lives of all, which is really broad and has changed since we were first founded in 1911. And the conditions under which we were first founded, a lot of challenges, a lot of overexploitation in the late 1800s of wildlife, a lot of challenges in protecting and propagating wildlife. And at that time, there just really wasn't much science. And so the Wildlife Management Institute was created to help develop, promote and advocate the science for protection and propagation of wildlife. And although we still do that, we do it in a lot of different ways than originally envisioned in 1911. Today, it runs the gamut. It's working with our industry partners, trying to promote the values of the federal excise taxes in the conservation space, to providing capacity to partners to actually deliver in fulfilling their mission. So, having been here just over 2 years, I'm still struggling to have an elevator speech that can encapsulate all that WMI does. I joke that it's got to be a really tall building because I can learn every day more and more about what WMI does. But, John, you said best kept secret. And, I think there's a real history and culture of humility at WMI, and it's not a lot of self-promotion. It's just getting the work done on the ground. Benefit, we're not a membership organization, so we don't have necessarily banquets or members or publications per se, and really we rely on our partners to help get the word out on the value that WMI can provide.
Yeah, I used to tell people, we're, for the kind of older terminology, I think we're sort of a think tank, except we do more than that because we think and do, we do the work as well. So, and I'm like you, after even 12, 13 years of the organization, I still struggle to really define something that encompasses everything we do, because we basically do whatever needs to be done in the conservation world that other groups, for whatever reason, can't get done. And that could be anything. Tomorrow might be something totally different. So. But with that in mind, we're in some sort of unique times now. We got lots of things going on at the federal level with budgeting process, and that always happens when new administrations come in. They have their priorities, and sometimes it works to our benefit, sometimes it doesn't. But even larger than that, there are things going on in the world today and in our country today. Cultural shifts, societal shifts, resource shifts. And we talk a lot about the North American model and what that, meant to conservation for the last 100 years. But WMI is starting on a new initiative now, helping to coordinate a new initiative for a more forward-looking, model that says, what should we be doing for the next 50 years? Tell us a little bit about that initiative and where we hope to go with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we call it a new initiative, but in many ways, it's just, old wine in new bottles. It's really kind of a reflection, and maybe putting a modern spin on a whole lot of foundational elements of conservation. And, you mentioned the North American model, but the North American model was, really came to light in the 1990s and was kind of capturing a lot of the ideas that were already in existence. And, the 7 tenets of the North American model, they weren't novel when they came out, but it was, again, a reflection. And so as we look at our history in conservation, it's relatively young, really about 150 years, and it really is tied back to an era of overexploitation where there weren't wildlife agencies, there weren't wildlife laws, there weren't federal excise taxes to fund the conservation and promotion of those activities. And in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt gave a speech on the steps of the White House to all the governors, and in that speech he said conservation is a national duty. Challenged all the citizens to view that conservation as their duty as an American citizen. Not too long after that, 1930, Aldo Leopold produced the American Game Policy. It contained 7 essential actions, as he called them. Durward Allen did a similar effort with the committee in 1973. And so you have these touchstones through history that really build on these foundations of conservation. And so as we embark on this new initiative for us, it really is more reflection and a reaffirmation and a reinvestment of these time-tested principles that have guided us to this point, trying to look at new or emerging things that perhaps haven't been included, things like collaborative conservation or landscape scale conservation, innovations that can add to that foundation, but not necessarily, fundamentally change it, but enhance it, modernize it, and set us up, better for the next 50 years. Given all those changes you mentioned, John, people are further and further removed from nature. They're further and further removed from their food sources, where their food comes from, and it presents some really significant challenges in the conservation space.
Yeah. I tell you, as you were talking about it, going back to the history of it, and it's not that old. It's kind of crazy, and it's not really all that. There's a lot of parts, but there's only a few main parts to conservation, right? It's the conservation organizations like the WMIs, the APWAs, and the nonprofits, and the state wildlife agencies, right? Then there's the industry that helps fund it and helps support it. And then there's the users, so 60 million or so active hunters, anglers, trappers, and shooters out there. But I always like to, we all we're so entrenched in this. We know some things, but what we're trying to do is educate our listeners and the folks that watch these episodes. So we've got 2 ex-directors of state agencies. So Tony, why don't you tell us a little bit about what APWA is, what it stands for, what it does, and when, some of the main responsibilities of state agencies on wildlife conservation.
Yeah. So APWA is the Association for Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and its membership includes all the state wildlife agencies, all 50 state wildlife agencies, but also the provincial and territorial agencies from the U.S. territories and Canadian provinces. And so, yes, membership is comprehensive. Excuse me. APWA contains the capacity of government affairs capacity, a whole host of various positions within APWA that represent the membership of all 50 states, the provinces, and territories for the conservation delivery, conservation awareness, education, enhancement. So it's been around roughly the same amount of time. I think they were founded early 1900s. They like WMI host an annual conference every year in September, have significant participation at that event. And they do a tremendous amount of work. They're located in Washington, D.C. and do a lot of work on the Hill, trying to promote awareness and legislation to the benefit of conservation.
Yeah. So, and APWA, is that organization representing all those 50 states, did several meetings ago put forth a resolution which passed, I believe, unanimously to address this foundational elements issue, and specifically called out WMI as being the the logical group to handle that. And, I think that, number one, it is an honor, I think, for the 50 states to put that trust in WMI to sort of be the facilitator and convener of this concept that may, help at least put sideboards on conservation for the next 50 years. But it's something that's needed. We talk about the North American model a lot, but we see, you read chat rooms and you see some of the sportswomen's groups out there talk about it, and folks talk about it like it's this tool that we actually use to drive conservation. And like you said, it's actually a historical look at, this happened in the 90s that looked at the past 100 years. And the issue is that sort of got weaponized. It became, depending on what your goals were, it got used, in some cases against, more traditional or logical conservation actions. And I think that's the important point to make, is that we need something that's prescriptive. We need something that's forward looking, because there are things happening now that we just didn't have when all those pieces were taking place that became what those authors described as North American model. Just off the top of my head, think about things like technology. There were no drones, there were no trail cameras, there were no cell cameras, there were no, all the things out there now that people can use, potentially to take game unless they've been made illegal. That's something that didn't occur, for the first 100 years of game management or wildlife management. We went from a time from scarcity to abundance. Now, in many cases, superabundance for species. So there's, basically the world changed, and we need a new look going forward, is the way I see the foundational elements.
Yeah, Jim, you asked a little bit about like the roles of state wildlife agencies, noting that both John and I spent time as agency directors. And, that's one of the things that I think really underscores the importance of this effort. When I look at all the challenges that state wildlife agencies are facing, almost all of them have roots in what could be viewed as a fairly narrow funding model, where you're reliant on that triangle that you just mentioned, where you have that user paid model and the federal excise tax, those tag and license fees, and excise tax from industry. So it's a fairly narrow model to fill a relatively really broad statutory charge. So all state wildlife agencies, somewhere in their statutes, their authorities, it basically says you have to take care of all the species for all the citizens, but you're doing so with a disproportionately small funding. And so I used to say in Nevada that we're relying on fewer than 3% of our citizens to generate approximately 95% of our budget to take care, and that comes from a desire to pursue only 8% of the 900 species that exist in Nevada. So somehow, as a director, you have to figure out how to get the other 97% of the citizens engaged and hopefully contributing in some way to conserve the other 92% of the species that people aren't hunting or angling for. And so it results in a lot of challenges to the makeup of the agency, the makeup of the commission, and those actions. So at one point in time, as director a few years ago, I had 7 simultaneous lawsuits, many of which I was named personally in my professional capacity. And 3 of those lawsuits went all the way to the state Supreme Court. And the contents of those lawsuits included things that related to predator control, things that related to trapping, bear management, defamation of character. And they were all born out of this challenge of reconciling a narrow funding model with a broad statutory charge. And it occurred to me that if we had, we use the North American model as though it were intended to be, all encompassing doctrine to justify our management actions. And although the 7 tenets that exist there aren't inaccurate, they are wholly inadequate to address all the challenges that we face. And so certainly those 7 tenets, as well as some of the other principles that have been mentioned, and maybe some that are absent, shining a brighter light on them, elevating them in a way that the directors can have some kind of support or guidance as they're sitting before legislative committees or judges or whoever else to kind of guide our conservation efforts and defend our models, our practices in a consistent and articulatable way. Just seems to make a lot of sense given where we are right now.
Yeah, it's frustrating to hear, the challenges, because the dedication I've seen over the past 15 years, there ain't too many rich people I met that work in conservation. They're doing this because they want to, manage healthy wildlife populations and keep habitat healthy for everybody. And it's so frustrating that it's a small group of dedicated people that do all this, that they don't get credit for it. So that's one of the reasons why we started connecting with conservation. We want to have folks like you on, tell their stories, and, inform people, not just the 60 million hats out there, but the general population. I mean, if tomorrow there were no state wildlife agencies, it wouldn't take long for wildlife to disappear. Once you have 330 million humans involved, wildlife doesn't manage itself. As much as some people want to say, "Oh, just let it be," it doesn't happen that way, right? So again, thank you for all you're doing. And you talked about the 7 tenants, real quick. Maybe just run through those for the audience to understand what those 7 tenants are. And I know it's a small portion of everything we do, but.
Great question, Jim. You're really going to challenge my memory here. I always start with public trust because that's something that comes up frequently, probably most often, but that wildlife are held in public trust, just simply meaning that the wildlife belong to all of us. Counter to the some of the European models of privatization of wildlife, the elimination of markets to eliminate the commercial use of wildlife, that wildlife shall be allocated by law. That's where a lot of commissions spend a lot of time and energy, setting up seasons and bag limits. The wildlife shall be used for legitimate purposes. Perhaps legitimate is a little subjective there, but I think certainly, speaking to wanton waste, and that wildlife is an international resource, recognizing that wildlife, don't honor, geopolitical boundaries and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That science should be the basis for policy. The idea that best available science, and then the last one, that the democratic process, that the hunting and fishing should be available and accessible to all through democratic processes. But I think it'd be great if folks wanted to Google that and learn a little bit more about it. There's a lot of thought that went into those. Valerius Geist is often touted as kind of the origin of those, compiling those, and then of course had some assistance in getting that out in the peer-reviewed literature and making it more widely known with John Organ and Shane Mahoney.
Yeah, I love the fact that every American has the opportunity to hunt and fish, and not every American knows that. I don't even think many of them know, or at least they're not taking advantage of it. So we have something that very few other countries has, the natural resources, the access to it. So get out there and enjoy nature, a little bit more. So appreciate you going through those.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to recognize too that because we have had that question come up about, well, what are these foundational elements going to look like? Why don't we just keep the model we have? And the concept there is most of those things, if not all of them, will be incorporated into the foundational elements. But there's some modernization things that need to happen. They need to be brought into the into sort of the current times that we live in. Things like animals that are super abundant. In some cases, they're excessive, or the technology issues. Like I said, we just didn't know about those things even 30 years ago. They just weren't a thing. And I think the biggest push there is broadening the awareness and the relevancy of conservation and what it means to our country. It's not just about deer and turkeys that people like to go hunt. It's clean water, clean air, healthy environment, healthy place for your kids to go play outside. All of that comes from really the habitat portion of what we do, but the habitat portion of what we do also manages all the population. So it gives us a unique opportunity, and our citizens a healthy place to live and grow and thrive. And if we can turn the old, regressive, or not regressive, but retrospective look of the North American model into something that not only updates it, but also makes more people aware of it, then I would call that a win, wouldn't you? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think, I think that's one of our biggest challenges right now is that people have grown more and more distant, as I said earlier, where their food comes from, where their clean water. I mean, people flip a switch and they don't have any idea the impacts of the, whether it's a dam or a coal-fired power plant and the transmission corridors. You flip a switch, you turn a light on, you're not really thinking about those impacts. You open the tap, the water comes out, you're confident that it's meeting all your needs, it's not contaminated, but you're not thinking about maybe where that water won't go as a result. And so having just a better connection to those natural resources and awareness, can only help us. It was something that's been recognized. Aldo Leopold recognized it, and I'll butcher the quote, but says something like, one of the greatest harms in not owning a farm is the thought that, heat, that food comes from the grocery and heat comes from the furnace, something along those lines. And it's continued. That trend that he recognized 100 years ago has continued, and it is a challenge to especially people that don't spend that time outdoors, that don't hunt or fish, and don't make that connection with wildlife and wild places like we do. And I really think that's just a natural progression. When you're out there, you connect to those places, you connect to those species, and through that connection, you develop respect, a deep, profound respect of animal behavior, etc. And then from that respect is really where that desire to protect comes from. And so by connecting people, you're really fostering and culturing this desire to protect and get engaged in conservation.
Yeah. So speaking to that connection, I know we've had several runs at trying to broaden the funding base beyond, the manufacturers of our traditional, hunting and angling products, and whether it was Teaming with Wildlife or Conservation and Reinvestment Act or many of the others that exercises is we've all been through for 20 some odd years now, trying to get additional users to have interest and be willing to pay for part of their piece of the conservation pie. One of the best quotes I ever heard was out of the Blue Ribbon panel for Fish and Wildlife Conservation. Really smart guy said, we came up with $1. We know what the dollar figure is. It's this. It's $1.6 billion at the time per year to fund all the rest, the other 95% of those species. But there was a second recommendation that came out of that panel that was we have to improve our relevancy among our constituents, the public. And the comment I heard was, if we had maintained our relevancy, if we still had the relevancy, we wouldn't be having to ask for the money. And I'm like, that's a profound statement, that if the public had come along for those 100 years knowing what we did and what we did for them and how we provided all these, not just opportunities, but all the benefits, ancillary benefits associated with that they would already be paying for it. They'd already be paying for those other 95%, but we lost that relevancy somewhere. And I know that's a big thing we work on, is relevancy with agencies now, and it kind of came out of that Blue Ribbon panel discussion. But talk a little bit about how we can improve relevancy of our community to the broader public.
Yeah, I think that right there is the answer, or the challenge, if you will, is how do you take something like conservation and make it mean more to more people. And it's interesting, you talk about, maybe if we'd maintained it. Just recently in reading some historic documents, two things in particular that really surprised me. One was that at the time in the 1920s, when Aldo Leopold wrote the 1930 American Game Policy, only 6% of Americans hunted. And I just thought, historically would have been a much larger percent. And so that was one thing that surprised me. And then also throughout the 1930 American Game Policy are claims that we need a dedicated, sustainable funding model for conservation. So in some ways, looking back, I'm not so sure we were ever enjoying the kind of relevance that we would really need to have for the funding. The relevancy roadmap, Jim, earlier you brought up APWA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And so coming out of that blue ribbon panel and that recommendation about relevancy and, engaging broader constituencies was a product called Relevancy Roadmap. And that was co-led by WMI and APWA. And it details specific strategies. It identifies specific barriers to relevancy and strategies with which to address them. I know that's available. You can do a quick Google search for the relevancy roadmap under APWA, and it'll take you to a copy of that. And you can kind of look at those barriers that exist, within agencies and within the general public. And, there's a number of efforts. I think, even talking about R3, recruitment, retention, reactivation of hunters and anglers. I mean, that is one avenue for relevancy. But there's a whole host of others because, you don't have the ability to turn everybody into a hunter or an angler, nor would you want to, but you still want conservation to be relevant in a way that I call it mundane relevance, where it's relevant every day. It's just one of those things that people wake up and, you brush your teeth every day. Nobody gets excited about it. It's just one of those things you do every day, you need to do. It's not the kind of urgent relevancy where, you're super relevant if you have a fire extinguisher in a fire or a boat in a flood, then you're the person of the hour. But we want to have that everyday kind of mundane relevancy where people understand that where their clean water, their clean air, the habitat, those places for their kids to recreate and play safely. It's because people are managing these lands. People are doing this work. They're not just leaving it to chance. And ultimately, connecting those people hopefully will be key to, having a broader funding base, and instead of just this disproportional reliance on hunters and industry partners to get the work done. It really, we're holding these resources in public's trust. It belongs to everybody, and as such, everybody should have some avenue in which they contribute to that conservation.
Yeah. Well, you guys certainly deserve all the credit for all the hard work you've done. And I'm glad to see, it was 100 years of head down and work hard and don't tell anybody. About 15 years ago, we realized we better start telling people about all the cool stuff that we do, so we can maintain that relevancy. But on that note, tell us where we can find more information on WMI, your website, your social media, that type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. We host an annual conference, the North American. This past year was the 90th annual North American. It's the North American Conference on Wildlife and North American Wildlife and Natural Resources Conference. You could certainly find more online about that. Encourage folks to attend that if you're at all interested. We have a monthly newsletter called the Outdoor News Bulletin. Try to capture emerging things and echo some partner voices in that publication as well. And that can be found at our webpage, which is wildlifemanagement.institute. And certainly a lot of additional information, those historic documents that we've been referencing from Teddy Roosevelt and Durward Allen and Aldo Leopold, those documents and many others are available there. So I think you could get lost in that wildlifemanagement.institute webpage and keep yourself entertained for at least an hour or two.
Well, in addition to that, we also have for the more people like the more technical aspects or the science-based aspects, the transactions, which are basically a summary of all the research papers that are presented there and all the policy papers are presented. We have every one of those available now for free on our website. So from day one when we started the North American, those are sometimes hard to find, but we've now got them up front and center, and they're available free for anyone to use. So Tony, thanks for coming on. Thanks for leading WMI the way you do. Thanks for signing my check. No, seriously, we appreciate all that you do for conservation. You and I go way back, back from when we were directors, and just glad to have you aboard. Glad to have you doing the work you're doing, and glad that for a first time in a while, I feel like I see conservation moving forward in leaps and bounds, and we're right there at the point of the spear, and that's the kind of organization I want to work for. So, thanks for doing that and coming on the show.
Well, thank you guys. Thanks for doing what you guys do. And this is a super important message. And, you guys are working towards that relevance that we're talking about. And it's super important message and super important work. So thank you guys for doing what you're doing and getting the word out.
Thank you. And to our listeners, if you like this one, please like it for us, subscribe, check out some of our other podcasts. We appreciate that. If you subscribe, you should get notices for it when the new ones drop. We drop one a week. Hopefully you'll like those. If you have any questions on them or comments on them, please feel free to send those to us. And other than that, we'll see you in the woods or on the water. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast. Please do us a favor and tell your buddies, friends, family, and others about what you've learned here today. If you like what you heard, come on back anytime and listen to another episode of the Connecting with Conservation podcast.